Hello, everybody. How are you? Can you hear me and see the questions?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay. Oh, I forgot. I didn't discuss the last few slides. Let me bring them up before we go to the questions. So that would be lecture 27. Okay, here we are. Okay. Okay, here we are. So let me discuss or go over the last few slides. We just have 3 slides from lecture 27, and then we'll go to questions for review. So remember we talked about the somatic reflex. So the somatic reflex are those reflexes related to skeletal muscle and they're suppose the response to skeletal muscle by the CNS is under voluntary control. But in reflexes, there is no brain activity. There's no voluntary control. It's a reflex. The action potentials go from the periphery to the spinal cord and right out to the effectors. No input from the brain, from higher centers. So a similar type of reflex happens in relation to the organs, to the viscera. These are visceral reflexes. And there are 2 different types. One is long, one is short. The long reflex network is related to conditions where the whole organ is involved. So the same as the somatic reflex, you have the receptors at the periphery. In this case, this would be inside the body, right? The receptors on the different organs, viscera. So the action potential is conducted through the sensory neuron, and you see the cell body at the ganglion. Then you see the spinal cord. You see an interneuron, and then the motor. The motor component here for the viscera, there's 2 motor neurons, right? If it would be the somatic reflex related to skeletal muscle, there would be just 1 motor neuron going directly from the gray matter at the spinal cord all the way to the muscle, to the skeletal muscle. Here, you can see that there's 2 motor neurons, the preganglionic and the postganglionic, and they synapse at the ganglia, the autonomic ganglia, can be sympathetic or parasympathetic. So sympathetic or parasympathetic, these are the divisions, the motor divisions of the ANS, the autonomic nervous system. Okay, so you have preganglionic and then you have the postganglionic, bringing the action potential to the effectors. In this case, effectors are going to be smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and glands. So this is the long version of this visceral reflex. So there's no input from higher centers in the brain. But there's also a shorter version which bypasses the action potential being conducted to the spinal cord. So this is in very emergency situations where you need a very quick response. So you bypass the spinal cord. So you have one sensory neuron and it synapses with a preganglionic neuron at the ganglia directly. Action potential continues with the postganglionic neuron. But you see here, there is no need to go to the spinal cord. So it's a very, very quick response, and it involves the response or the control in a small area of the organ. So here, the long arm of the reflex controls or sends a response to the entire organ, while this short reflex only sends the response to a small area, the kidney or the liver or whatever. Okay. So for the autonomic nervous system, it's autonomic. That means its basal function does not require input from the CNS, but the CNS can have a major effect on the functioning of the ANS. So, you know, the hypothalamus, posterior and lateral hypothalamus, remember all those nuclei that we discussed that are located at the hypothalamus. The ones that are located at the posterior and lateral areas of the hypothalamus send inputs to the sympathetic nervous system. The ones located in the anterior and medial areas of the hypothalamus send inputs to the parasympathetic. So remember, location, location, location. You need to know how the network, how the impulse, where does it travel to. So if it travels to the posterior lateral hypothalamus, the input goes to the sympathetic. If it travels to the anterior and medial hypothalamus, it goes to the parasympathetic. And then the cerebral cortex with the limbic system and so on, amygdala is involved in emotional stress. And emotional stress is associated with the sympathetic nervous system, not parasympathetic. Okay, so one disease aspect or disorder associated with the enteric nervous system. Remember, the enteric nervous system has more neurons than the spinal cord, and it's totally dedicated to regulating our digestive system. So there's two, the myenteric plexus that is regulating the movement along the digestive tract. So sometimes the myenteric nerve plexus might not be working properly, and here this condition known as achalasia. So that means that the sphincter here does not open. So this is a problem with the myenteric plexus. So that means that the food gets stuck in the esophagus and does not flow through to the stomach. So this is a condition known as achalasia, and it is associated with the dysfunction of the myenteric plexus. Okay, so I think this is the last. So let's go here. Just want to go back here. Yeah. So if you remember the myenteric plexus, where did I here? It's involved in the movement of the food, of the bolus down the digestive tract. So if it's not working properly at the sphincter between the esophagus and the stomach, then the food gets stuck there and leads to achalasia. And remember, the submucosal plexus, its function is to control the secretion, absorption, and blood flow. So the functioning, the physiological functioning of the gut. Okay, any questions on this that you might want me to answer? If not, we'll move on to the questions I prepared for the review. Shall I move on? Yes, no? Someone? Yes. Okay, let's go. So getting out of here. And now let's go to the questions. Now be prepared. These questions were sort of prepared in a rush. So many of them have, let's see, what do you think about these questions? Oh, wait, now I lost. Go in the chat. Good. I see the chat. Okay, so let's go. So I divided them by lectures. So we have 9 lectures, right? From lecture 18 all the way to lecture 27. By now, you should be experts on this. So let's start with the first one. A patient experiences a sudden drop in blood pressure after standing up quickly. So emergency situation. Within seconds, within seconds, the body detects this change and triggers a rapid increase in heart rate to maintain adequate blood flow. Which division? Sympathetic, right? So it's fast. It's an emergency situation. Sympathetic is the correct answer. Okay. So someone said parasympathetic. Remember, parasympathetic is active under leisure, under calm conditions for maintaining homeostasis. A person accidentally touches a hot pan and quickly pulls their hand away. Then, moments later, becomes aware of the pain and decides to run cold water over the burn. Which sequence below correctly matches the nervous system functions involved? So question here, is this the same level of difficulty as the exam questions? Yes. Okay, so everybody here agrees in D, yes. So sensory, the receptors are turned on and goes to the central nervous system, and then motor to design a response. B, you cannot go directly from sensory to motor. That would be a reflex. You go sensory, integrative, and motor. Anyway, it goes to the spinal cord anyway. The spinal cord is also part of the integrative. So a reflex would not go sensory motor. Only in the visceral reflex that we just discussed. The parasympathetic system is known as the rest and digest. Sympathetic system increases blood flow, also known as the fight or flight. Exactly, Kevin, you have it. In what case where there is not an integrative? Well, the only case was what I just explained in that visceral short reflex, where it goes right from sensory to motor without going to the spinal cord. So 2 is D, right? It goes sensory, integrative, and motor. Um, so, Kevin, is it only sensory to motor in visceral because we have no control of it, right? Well, remember that in visceral, there's the long and the short, right? So let me show you this here. If we go here, you see visceral reflex. You have the long reflex, it still goes to the spinal cord, integrative, right? Spinal cord is integrative. It's only the short that goes directly from the sensory to the motor, bypassing the spinal cord. So whenever you involve the spinal cord, that's the integrative branch of, here we go, there. Now I have to bring this up again and this again. Okay. Okay, Kevin, is this clear? But in visceral, there is still interneuron between sensory and motor without CNS. Yes, except in the short arm, the short reflex that I showed. Okay. Lecture 19. A patient is bitten by a rabid animal. So rabies. This animal is infected with the rabies virus. Within days, the virus is found multiplying in the patient's CNS. Which neuronal mechanism best explains how the virus reached the cell bodies of neurons so quickly? Exactly. So remember, the virus comes from the periphery all the way into the CNS. So retrograde transport. So the correct answer is B, fast retrograde transport. If it would be anterograde, it would go from the cell body to the axon terminal. Okay, a neurologist, this Zoom is recorded. Yes, absolutely. I hope so. It's supposed to be. Let's see, does it say here? But I think, yes, it is. Okay, so we hear a neurologist examines a patient with loss of coordination following localized cerebellar. Now make sure that you read things properly. It's cerebellar. So that means it's related to the cerebellum, not the cerebrum. So a neurologist examines a patient with loss of coordination following localized cerebellar damage. The disrupted neurons are large interneurons responsible for integrating signals. Which structural class is mostly affected? So remember, cerebellum has these Purkinje cells. Remember, these Purkinje cells are GABAergic. They have the neurotransmitter GABA. They are inhibitory. So the correct answer is D. Okay. A child's response to a painful stimulus becomes noticeable faster as they mature. Which cellular change best explains this improvement? Increased formation of nissel bodies, increased number of dendrites, faster slow axonal transport. C, right? So becomes noticeable faster. Faster means you require myelination. So the correct is C.
Professor,
Yes?
I just wanted to make sure I don't get confused on this. So on the Purkinje cell question one, the Purkinje cells are from the cerebellum, and those, even though those are multipolar, they're not sensory neurons, right? They're integrative or interneurons.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Okay. So we move on to number 4. Um, let me see here something. Yeah. After a knife injury to the forearm, a patient slowly regains sensation over several months. Slowly regains sensation over several months. Imaging shows that the neuron cell body survived. So that means there is regeneration. Which factor in the peripheral nervous system made this recovery possible? So which ones? Let's see what we have here. Oligodendrocytes. No, oligodendrocytes are not in the peripheral nervous system. Neurolemma formation by Schwann cells. Yes, this is very important. The Schwann cells divide and they form that tunnel that guides the axon regrowth. So B is the correct. Microglia, no. Astrocytes, no. Okay, pretty good, pretty good. A scientist designs a viral vector for gene therapy that must reach neuronal cell bodies after being injected into muscle tissue. Which transport mechanism should the vector exploit to reach the soma? Well, this is sort of repetition from a previous, the rabies vector, the rabies virus question. So it has to be fast retrograde transport, right? Because it's going from the periphery to the cell body. Okay. Now we go on to chapter 20. A patient receives a high dose of potassium chloride. Now, let's see if you get this right. A patient receives a high dose of potassium chloride by mistake during an IV infusion. I'm looking at the right because I have to allow students to come in. Minutes later, the ECG, electrocardiogram, becomes flat and the heart stops. Which mechanism best explains this event? I want to see. Someone, did you answer this? B. Okay. Yeah. Is the lecture recording? Yes, the lecture is being recorded. So the correct answer is B, because remember, you have more potassium inside the cell than outside. That differential distribution so that you have the resting membrane potential, which in the neurons is minus 70 millivolts. So if you have too much potassium on the outside, then there's no resting membrane potential. So elevated extracellular potassium eliminates the resting membrane potential, preventing action potential generation. So if you don't have resting membrane potential, you cannot have action membrane potential, and you cannot have the heart pumping. Can you explain why not A? So A says increased potassium enhances sodium potassium pump activity, leading to hyperpolarization of cardiac cells. Now, the potassium doesn't enhance sodium potassium pump. What the sodium potassium pump is, it brings sodium into the cell and pumps potassium to the outside. So by having more potassium on the outside, this would not help the sodium potassium pump. I hope this is understandable, Mohammed. Okay, let's go on. A person steps on a sharp tack and immediately withdraws the foot before conscious feeling pain. Which event triggers the first action potential in the sensory neuron? So is it opening of voltage-gated sodium channels? Is it opening of mechanically gated sodium channels? Yes, because you're making pressure on the foot. So that's the mechanically gated sodium channels. Remember, the graded potentials, they involve chemically sodium channels or chemically gated channels or mechanically gated channels. So here, because you have a sharp tack pressuring on the foot, B is the correct answer. So potassium chloride adds more potassium. And since potassium makes it negative, it doesn't reach. And that is what leads to the cardiac arrest. Sorry, I'm a bit slow in understanding. So what happens here is if you have too much potassium on the outside, then you cannot have that difference because remember you have under resting membrane, when the neuron is resting, there's a lot of sodium outside, which makes it positive. And there's more potassium inside, but there's proteins and phosphates, so it's negative inside. And it's that difference between negative and positive that makes the resting membrane potential possible, the minus 70 millivolts. And what contributes to that resting membrane potential is high levels of leakage potassium channels, which allow potassium to leave the neuron, go to the outside. But if there's too much potassium outside, this doesn't happen, and therefore you cannot establish the rest membrane potential. Okay, so let's move on here. A patient receives dental anesthesia, lidocaine. Before a procedure, sensation disappears, but muscle control of the jaw remains largely intact. Which explains why pain sensation is lost before motor function? What is it? Pain fibers have more sodium channels. No. Pain fibers have larger diameters. No. Nobody wants to guess this one? C. Pain fibers are smaller and more sensitive to sodium channels blockage. Correct. So lidocaine, what it does, it inhibits its the opening of sodium channels. And the pain fibers are more sensitive to this local anesthesia. So C is the correct one. A neuron experiences a strong where am I? Wait 1 sec. 20, yes. Where were here? A neuron experiences a strong depolarizing graded potential. So depolarizing graded potential that does not reach threshold. What will happen next? Anyone wants to guess? An action potential will still fire. No, because it does not reach threshold. The graded potential will travel the entire length of the axon. No, graded potentials don't travel down the axon. The graded potential will decay, yes, within a few micrometers, and no actual potential will occur. Absolutely correct. Voltage-gated sodium channels, the neuron enters absolute refractory period. No, C is the correct answer. Okay, a drug is developed that slows voltage-gated potassium channels. Remember, these are the ones involved in hyperpolarization and also repolarization. So a drug is developed that slows voltage-gated potassium channels closing during repolarization. So remember the graph, depolarization, you go up, you go from minus 72, minus 55, that's the threshold. Once you reach minus 55, you spike up to plus 30. That's the depolarization stage. Then repolarization, when you open potassium channels, potassium moves out and it becomes now more negative. So which effect would this drug most likely produce? Larger depolarization peak? No, this never happens. So C. Faster return to resting membrane potential? No, because it's slowing potassium channels. Prolonged after hyperpolarization? Yes, more negative membrane potential. That is correct. Elimination of the absolute refractory period and opening of mechanically gated channels. So prolonged after hyperpolarization, because now you have it become more and more negative. More and more potassium is leaving the cell. So you have more and more negative instead of reaching the resting membrane potential, which is minus 70 millivolts. Now it's hyperpolarized, goes to minus 80 millivolts. Okay, we move on to lecture 21. A patient with a myelinating disorder begins to show slowed reflexes and muscle weakness. Which change in nerve conduction best explains these symptoms? So the myelination is dysfunctional. Saltatory conduction becomes faster. No, because the myelination is not working. Continuous conduction in unmyelinated axons. Unmyelinated, nothing to do with myelin. Conduction becomes slower and less efficient because the action potential can no longer jump between nodes. That's correct, because you have the Schwann cells that are covering, or oligodendrocytes are covering or myelinating the axon, and therefore the sodium ions diffuse in that area of the axon that is covered by the myelin. So if there's no myelin there, the sodiums can exit, and this means that the conduction becomes slower. Okay. So a soccer player sprains her ankle and immediately applies an ice packet, an ice pack. After a few minutes, pain from the injury noticeably reduced. Which mechanism primarily explains this effect? So you're slowing down the action potential. Cooling increases action potential amplitude. No. Cooling speeds conduction. No. Cooling reduces potassium pump. No. Cooling slows the rate of impulse conduction in pain fibers. Remember, the speed of impulse conduction depends on temperature and on the diameter of the fiber, the neuron fiber or the axon, and also on myelination. So these three factors, right? So temperature slows down the conduction. So D is correct. Okay, we come back to lidocaine. A dentist injects lidocaine near a tooth before drilling. The patient feels pressure, but no sharp pain during the procedure. Which statement best explains this selective loss of pain? Well, this is sort of already. Lidocaine selectively blocks mechanically gated channels. No. What is it? 3. Small diameter pain fibers. This is repeated, right? We know that lidocaine is a sodium channel blocker. That's what this drug does. Okay. A student A student lightly touches a hot object, then firmly grabs it by mistake. So you have here a change in the strength of the stimulus, right? Lightly versus firmly. Both contacts reach threshold. Reach threshold. So both reach minus 55 millivolts and generate the action potentials in the same sensory neuron. According to the all or none principle, how does the nervous system code the difference between light and strong stimulus? Stronger stimuli produce action potentials of larger amplitude. Stronger stimuli produce action potentials that travel faster. Stronger stimuli recruit more sensory neurons on increased firing frequency. C is the correct one. Remember, you have an all or once you reach threshold, it's the all or none response. It becomes independent of the strength. So you have here now more sensory neurons being recruited and increasing the fire frequency. Okay, let me move here, my page. Two types of sensory fibers carry information from the skin. Large myelinated A fibers and small unmyelinated C fibers. So A and C. Which situation would most strongly depend on rapid conduction in A fibers rather than slower C fibers? A slow, dull ache several minutes after an injury. Immediate withdrawal of the hand from a very hot stove. Which situation would most strongly depend on rapid conduction? So the rapid withdrawal of away from the stimulus. So B is the correct answer. On now to, am I going at the right speed? We're going now to lecture 22. Patient receives acupuncture and reports reduced pain afterward. Which mechanism best explains this effect? Remember, we talked about this, that the acupuncture, what it seems to do is to activate the release of endorphins, which are our own opioids. So substance speed, this is involved in pain perception. Enhance activation of nitric oxide. Now, nitric oxide, remember, it's a neurotransmitter that causes vasodilation. Elevated release of endogenous opioids, such as enkephalins. That's correct. Blockage of glutamate and inhibition of acetylcholinesterase. So when you find and you're sure that you have the correct answer, just put it down. 2. A patient taking nitroglycerin. Remember nitroglycerin, what does it do? It produces nitric oxide. For chest pain, experiences improved blood flow. I just said nitric oxide increases is a vasodilator. Which cellular event directly produces this therapeutic response? NO, nitric oxide, opens ligand-gated sodium channels. NO diffuses into smooth muscle and causes relaxation. Absolutely. That's how it works. B. NO binds extracellular receptors. It does not cause vasoconstriction. Increases substance P, no. Activates acetylcholinesterase, no. So vasodilation binds to extracellular, diffuses into smooth muscle and causes relaxation. So it's a neurotransmitter. Okay. A student drinks several cups of coffee before an exam. Which outcome best reflects caffeine's effect on neuronal function? So you know caffeine is a stimulant. So it's going to allow the neurons to respond faster or easier because they are already partially depolarized. So let's see what is the response? What is the correct answer? It lowers the threshold for excitation, facilitating impulse conduction. So it lowers the threshold, so it partially depolarizes the neurons. So that's why it is a stimulator. It lowers the threshold for excitation, facilitating impulse conduction. 4, now this is very hard. A marine biologist, I would not have a question like this. I just wanted to see if anyone knows the answer to this. Let's see. A marine biologist accidentally ingests shellfish contaminated with saxitoxin. Which symptom would best help distinguish this toxin from tetrodotoxin? A. So the answer is C. Milder sensory changes, including hot-cold reversal sensation. So this is a very hard question. I would not have a question like this. I even have to look at the answer. Okay. This was just to see if anyone would know. These questions need a little thinking time, but we have only 1 minute to read and answer. That's correct. If you know this very well, and if you know it very well, you will be able to immediately find the correct answer, so you don't need to go through all the answers. Okay, here we go. A postsynaptic neuron receives, so that's the difference between anatomy and physiology, right? Anatomy is based on memory, so it's fast. Here, you need to digest the material. A postsynaptic neuron receives rapid repeated firing. So right here, the same neuron repeats, gets stimulated for one presynaptic terminal, eventually reaching threshold and generating an action potential. Which process is responsible? B, temporal summation. I mean, some of the questions are very, very easy, like this one. Okay. A woman receives an epidural. So now we're down to spinal cord. Lecture 23. A woman receives an epidural during childbirth and becomes unable to push effectively. Which mechanism best explains this outcome? Well, this is not a very good situation because the anesthesia is supposed to only affect pain, not affect the muscles. So which mechanism best explains this outcome? The anesthetic blocks sensory and motor nerve conduction in spinal roots. So that's the problem. The person cannot push. So it has to be very, very careful, this type of anesthesia. So it's not the subarachnoid. Anesthesia reduces CSF production, and anesthetic blocks nociceptors in the pia mater. Okay. Let's move on. A patient presents with loss of sensation along the medial thigh and difficulty detecting touch in that area. Okay, so this here, so medial thigh and difficulty detecting touch. So there's a problem with the skin, right? What is the, wait a minute. What is the answer for one? So the answer for one is C. The anesthetic blocked the sensory and motor nerve conduction in the spinal root. So it went too deep. The anesthesia went too deep. A patient presents with loss of sensation along the medial thigh and difficulty detecting touch in that area. Okay, detecting touch. Touch is skin. Which spinal structure is more likely compromised? Okay, I would not make you know what all the different areas of the spinal cord regulate what. But so this seems like a difficult question, but it isn't. Here, what is you need to concentrate is detecting touch. So touch, that's skin. So dermatome involved, right? Remember how the body, the skin is divided into different areas, and these dermatomes are very important, and they're used for diagnostic tools to determine if there's damage to a specific spinal nerve. So by detecting difficulty in detecting touch, that means that there's a dermatome involved. Okay. Moving on. A patient steps on the sharp nail and immediately withdraws the foot while the other leg extends to maintain balance. So now here you have the control in both sides of the body, right? So it's a reflex involving both sides, ipsilateral and contralateral. So which one is the reflex that controls both sides, ipsilateral and contralateral? That would be C, the flexor, the withdrawal reflex and cross extension reflex. So C would be the correct answer. So you see that there are two actions here involved, one on each side. A. A clinician notices that an adult patient exhibits toe fanning during the Babinski test. So that means there's something. What does this most likely indicate? Damage to the cortical spinal tract. So you're not supposed to, a normal person will not have this toe fanning response. So the Babinski test indicates that there's damage to the cortical spinal tract, causing loss of normal inhibition. Okay, a 3-month-old infant has uncoordinated limb movements, cannot yet sit independently. So immediately you know that there's something wrong with myelination. Which physiological process explains this developmental pattern? So incomplete myelination of cortical spinal tracts controlling fine motor skills. This is, you already know, if you know that myelination is involved, the only answer that has myelin in it is C. Okay, move on to lecture 24. A newborn has obstructed flow of CSF at the cerebral aqueduct. So remember the ventricles, the two lateral ventricles on the hemispheres. And then you have the third ventricle, the aqueduct, and then the fourth ventricle. So that means the CSF cannot flow to the aqueduct. If untreated, what is the most likely consequence? So that means that the cerebral spinal fluid cannot flow through the subarachnoid space and then through the ventricles. Therefore, it's going to accumulate and is going to cause hydrocephalus, increased intracranial pressure, and enlarged ventricles because the CSF is accumulating there. Okay, a patient with Parkinson's disease, you know this very well if you saw the movie. Did anyone see the movie from the ones that are here? Anyone saw a movie? Yes? I hope you thought that it was interesting. Okay. A patient with Parkinson's disease is treated with L-DOPA. Remember, L-DOPA is the precursor of dopamine, and you cannot treat with dopamine because dopamine does not cross the blood-brain barrier, but the L-DOPA, which is the precursor, does. So it's treated with L-DOPA rather than dopamine. Which statement best explains why this therapy works? Dopamine is lipid soluble. No. Dopamine is destroyed by CSF enzymes. No, dopamine cannot cross the blood-brain barrier, but the L-DOPA can. So C is the correct one. Okay, during a difficult delivery, a baby experiences during a difficult delivery, a baby experiences prolonged interruption of the mother's blood flow before it can breathe on its own. So that means that the brain is not getting enough oxygenation. What is the greatest risk of the baby's brain? Permanent neuronal damage due to oxygen deprivation. Now, this is an easy. Okay. Let's move on. A patient develops a tumor in the region of the hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Okay. Hypothalamus and posterior pituitary. Which of the following functions is most likely to be directly affected because these areas lack a typical blood-brain barrier? Okay, so what here? Formation of GRI? No. Release of ADH and oxytocin? Yes, because these two antidiuretic hormone and oxytocin are produced by the hypothalamus and move on to the posterior pituitary. So if there's a tumor there, this cannot happen. So it's going to be affected. So there's no flow of ADH and oxytocin from the hypothalamus to the pituitary, posterior pituitary. Hey. Oops. A patient survives a traumatic brain injury. Professor, oh, what does it say? Can you also post these questions? Okay, the questions are posted, and today I will review the answers. So there will be two files, one just with the questions with no answers, and then another file with the answers. It's on Brightspace. Yes. Okay, so which one are we on? A patient survives a traumatic brain injury, but becomes impulsive, rude, and unreliable, although motor and language abilities are largely intact. This presentation most closely resembles which classical case and brain region damage? Well, you know our friend Phineas Gage, with ventral medial frontal lobe damage. That's when we found out that the frontal lobe is involved in emotion. I'm going the opposite direction. Okay, so move on to lecture 25. A stroke patient can understand spoken and written language, but struggles to form words. Okay, so Broca is intact or not? A stroke patient can understand. So if they understand, that means Warnick is intact, but cannot form words. Broca is not working. So which brain area is most likely damaged? C. A patient has no trouble moving their eyes or recognizing objects. A patient has no trouble moving their eyes or recognizing objects, but cannot understand the meaning of spoken words. That means Warnick area, right? Immediately you know. D is the correct answer. A right-handed artist suffers damage to the right parietal lobe, ignoring the left side of their body and left side of space. What syndrome best explains this? Neglect syndrome, right? And never forget, right side of the brain controls the left side of the body. So neglect syndrome. Okay, a patient with severe epilepsy has their corpus callosum surgically cut, split brain. Okay, now this one you have to think. When a picture of a key is shown only to the left visual field, so it's only the left eye is going to be activated, which response is most likely? So it goes from left to the optic nerve, goes to the occipital lobe, then it cannot go to the left side. So the patient cannot talk. But the patient can move the hand. So the patient cannot say key, but can pick up a key, right? So this is showing again the crossover of the optic nerves. So B is the correct one.
Professor, can you re-explain that, please?
Yes, because remember, what side of the brain is the language centers? The Broca and Wernicke are where? On the left side of the brain, right? So if the left eye is active, right? And it goes through the optic nerve, goes to the right side of the brain, goes to the visual center on the right side, occipital lobe, but then it cannot cross over, the information cannot cross over to the left side, where the Broca and Wernicke areas are. So the patient cannot speak, cannot say key, because that impulse does not reach the Broca and Wernicke area. But it can reach the somatosensory area, the motor area on the right side. So it can pick up the patient with the left hand. Wait a minute. 4. Are we here? Yeah, here it is. Okay. I'm not sure if this is correct. Yes, because it goes to the right side. Oh, that's right. So I was thinking, how can this be? Okay. So it goes from the left eye, crosses over through the optic nerve, goes to the cerebral cord, to the occipital lobe. Then it goes to the motor area on the right side, which controls the left hand, right? So it goes down to the spinal cord, crosses over at the medulla, and goes to the left hand side. So, are you clear? What if it was shown on the right side? Good question, Madison. If it would be on the right side, so the right eye goes through the optical nerve, goes to the left hemisphere, where to the left occipital lobe, and it can go right to the Broca area. So that means the patient could say the key word and would pick it up with the right hand. So that would be A. Okay. Now here we are. A patient has difficulty maintaining balance and shows uncoordinated, drunken-looking movement. Immediately you know that this is the cerebellum, right? The problem is with the cerebellum. Easy. Let's move on to lecture 26. A 62-year-old patient develops resting tremor. So you know this already is Parkinson's disease. Muscle rigidity, slow movement, bradykinesia. Imaging shows degeneration of substantia nigra. Remember this in the midbrain, substantia nigra? And so, which neurotransmitter imbalance best explains these symptoms? So, too little dopamine, right? Because the dopaminergic neurons in the substantia nigra are degenerated. Okay. After a car accident, so C or E, here the correct is too little dopamine, because substantia nigra has the dopaminergic neurons, right, which are degenerating. So the correct answer would be E. After a car accident, a patient has irregular breathing and unstable heart rate. So you know there must be a problem with the medulla. The neurologist suspects damage to a vital reflex center. Which region is most likely? D, the medulla, right? That's where the cardiovascular and respiratory centers are located. 3, a patient in the ICU is unresponsive to sounds, light, and pain. So it seems that there's a problem. If it was only breathing, oh, well, the PONS is also controlling respiration, but the most important respiratory control center is in the medulla. Okay. So it would still be medulla and pneumotaxic. A patient in the ICU is unresponsive to sounds, light, and pain. The electroencephalogram shows no detectable brain waves on 2 recordings 24 hours apart. So you already know the patient is dead. Which structure's failure is most closely linked to loss of consciousness, and what clinical state does this support? So, reticular activating center, RAS, and brain death. It's the only one here that says brain death. That would be an easy answer. Okay. An adult patient's EEG, electroencephalogram, during an office visit shows high amplitude delta waves. Remember, delta waves are during sleeping, but this individual is awake and alert. Which is the best interpretation of this finding? Normal pattern during calm wakefulness. Normal finding in adults under emotional stress. No, that's theta waves. Normal variation indicating REM sleep. Abnormal pattern suggesting possible brain dysfunction. Right, because the delta waves are specific for sleeping. So if the patient is wide awake, that means there's something wrong. Okay. A 70-year-old man suddenly develops weakness on the right side of his body and difficulty speaking. So, right side of the body and difficulty speaking. Symptoms persist for months. Imaging reveals infarcted brain area. Which diagnosis best fits this patient? Cerebrovascular accident, a stroke, right? Okay. So last chapter, the autonomic nervous system. So a patient is given a selective beta blocker. Remember, we talked about this. It has a lot of side effects for hypertension shortly after they develop wheezing and shortness of breath. That's one of the side effects. Which receptors blockade best explains this side effect? Here, beta 2 receptors that are linked to bronchi in smooth muscle in the bronchi. D, correct. After a spinal cord injury, a patient can still show local reflex control of gut motility, peristalsis. Are we talking about the enteric nervous system? Even when spinal input is disrupted, which nervous system most directly accounts for this preserved function? D, enteric nervous system. We talked a lot about it. A man is startled by a loud noise. His heart rate and blood pressure rise, pupils dilate, and bronchioles open. Which division and main neurotransmitter at most effector organs are responsible for this response? Sympathetic, norepinephrine, noradrenergic, right? The sympathetic acetylcholine or nicotinic, this would be sweat glands. Okay. Now I just have two more questions. A drug that selectively stimulates beta 2 receptors. Remember, we already know here that the beta 2 receptors control or are present in smooth muscle at the bronchi. So where were we here? A drug that selectively stimulates beta 2 receptors is prescribed for asthma. Which of the following is the desired primary effect in this patient? So, relaxation of bronchial smooth muscle. So, beta 2 receptors again, smooth muscle at the bronchi. Final. A patient has ptosis, drooping eyelid, miosis, constrict pupil, and lack of sweating on one side of the face. So you know right away that the problem is, this is the Horner's syndrome, and it's the superior cervical sympathetic ganglion. Okay, so how do we do? You did pretty well. You have a lot of information here, and you can go over these questions. And as I said, I'm going to make the answers visible. So we reached the end of the lectures. So any questions, any issues that you would like to discuss?
Professor, I have a question.
Yes,
You know you have these things in parentheses and like the semicolon. Are we gonna get those on the exam or is it just
like
gonna be
this here.
like yeah, like that?
Yes.
Okay. All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, by the way.
Okay. Okay. So study hard. You still have a few days, and we'll all meet at the auditorium on December 16th.
Yeah, I'm really sorry. I just have one more question.
Well, wait, let me just answer here. I will answer. Will we
Okay.
be able to backtrack? No. Thank you for all the help and so on. Simple slight hints in the questions. see how you will give slight hints in the questions. Would you do that on the exam also? Okay. Someone had a question. Please do ask.
Yes. Just to check, you said that all lab grades and basically all grades are due the 14th, right?
Right.
Okay. Because I just took I was one of the last groups to take it, so I just took my neurology, like anatomy exam yesterday. So I just want to check that it's
Yes.
due.
So you should have your grade. You took it yesterday, you should have it today. If you don't have it today, you can email your lab instructor, because I asked all lab instructors to post the grades 24 hours after the exam.
Okay, I'll email him. Thank you so much.
So when will you be able to download the final exam? 48 hours before. So that means on Monday, right? No, that would be 24, Sunday. I will send a message. Okay? And you will also, some students will be taking the makeup. So you will also have to download the makeup. And only those students that email me will have access to the makeup. Okay? Okay, everybody. Bye-bye. I enjoyed the semester. Bye-bye. Good luck. Study hard.